This is System Crash, a weekly tech news show willing to tell the hard truths about how tech and the titans who own and operate it is really transforming the world. I'm Paris Marks.
And I'm Brian Merchant.
This system has just begun to crash, so support the show by heading over to patreon.com/systemcrashpod, where you can sign up to get monthly bonus episodes. Also, rate the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. This week, we're continuing our Elon In Power series by digging into SpaceX's history and what it can teach us about Musk and the power he's able to accrue over the past couple decades. To do that, we have the perfect guest, Lora Kolodny, a tech reporter at CNBC Digital, whose work is essential reading for anyone looking to know what's actually going on in Musk's corporate empire. Lora, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. I am so excited to dive into this subject because as I've covered and written about and thought about Tesla a lot over the years, but SpaceX, not so much. To me, it's a little bit more of sort of a question mark, even though it's kind of what really sort of marks Musk's imperial era, we could say, his second era after his PayPal and Zip2 days, after he's truly becoming the Musk as we know it. It kind of begins with SpaceX. Would you say that's fair to say?
I think that's absolutely fair to say. And people think it's Tesla, but it's definitely SpaceX. Tesla has been the source of lots of Elon's liquid wealth and his celebrity and his cool, what there is of his cool. The truth is he met the Tesla founders who invented the battery pack and some of the other core technologies in the cars to this very day, Martin Eberhard and Mark Tarpenning, because of their mutual participation in the Mars Society. Martin and Mark told me we met Elon and we knew he might be open to investing in something as crazy as an automaker, a car startup, because he was already taking such a risk on rockets at SpaceX. And they were all involved in Mars Society, and that's how they were connected. You know, it also starts to show Elon Musk, you see his first connections and interest in Russia and geopolitics over there, right? FinTech, payment tech, that's one thing. But he was looking at possibly attaining technology from Russia to get SpaceX off the ground, no wordplay intended. And these things are very revealing. His appetite for risk, in particular capital-intensive hardware risk, and his willingness to look at other countries that might be seen as foreign adversaries at the time.
It's really interesting too to go back to that moment and that story, because this initial kind of thing that Elon Musk was doing was he wanted to make the public interested in Mars, right? To make the case for why we should go to Mars. So he wanted to get this rocket to basically do this stunt. I think it was to plant, some sort of plant or something on Mars so we could see it on there. Maybe I'm misremembering part of it. And so in order to do that, he goes to Russia to try to acquire this rocket, and it doesn't work out. And he comes back and the story is, okay, this is when he decides to just start a rocket company and do it himself. Am I understanding that properly? And what's the significance of that moment?
I don't actually know that stunt, but the reusable rocket story was his story. You got to make space flight accessible, more affordable. We're going to use reusable rockets. It was an idea that had been tried and no one had succeeded commercially. But just like his other companies with PayPal, with Tesla, there was this draw hey, if I can overcome these regulatory hurdles. Before the Commercial Space Act, which I think was 2004, written into a bill and sponsored by Dana Rohrabacher, Musk's good buddy from Republican California, there was little hope that there would be a private space industry, right? The X Prize and the Commercial Space Act, these things were nascent. Just like Tesla was taking on the idea that you can only sell cars through franchisee corporate dealerships. They were going to go direct and deal with all these fragmented state laws and take on that challenge. SpaceX was betting big that they could help bring about private sector space industry.
And was the goal from the beginning always to sort of win a government contract that would undergird the business and make it all possible? Or what was the business sense in those early days?
I don't think they totally knew, to be candid, but you can guess from Musk enlisting Gwen Shotwell that yes, he envisioned at least some significant part of the business, the revenue would come from government contracts. She hailed from, a decade at Aerospace Corporation and was bringing in this industry expertise that wasn't just the engineering and the management, but the business development.
I think it's another great example of this. So this is something that he gets into because he wants to, because it's exciting to him, because it aligns with his interests in science fiction and perhaps his burgeoning ego as somebody who can make big things happen. And he gets into it without a business model. What are sort of like the early ingredients? You mentioned getting sort of a big name hire, which was integral to sort of anyone taking it seriously. So how does this thing sort of, not to dance around another pun, get off the ground? And how is it working in those early days? What is Musk's sort of day-to-day involvement in this?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, we can't forget about SpaceX's technical co-founder, Tom Mueller, the person who designed the rocket engines. He's still in the industry and he has his own company, Impulse Space. And Tom has given a lot of really interesting interviews out there. There are a lot of people through the years who would have like taken a bullet for Elon because he was willing to place these big bets. And anyone who underestimates his understanding, it's like we know about the rockiness and all of this, and that he's not exactly like designing the rockets solo, but he does understand a lot about things like orbital physics. I hear this from his employees at SpaceX, at Tesla. And it's a reason he's always been this incredible recruiter, had this some appetite for risk and the capital from getting lucky with PayPal. Right? Peter Thiel wanted the competition out of the way and he just got so lucky with that whole thing. But I mean, he used that wealth and then he had personal wealth. His family had some wealth. He sort of presents himself like he was just a poor immigrant coming to the US by way of Canada. But like, there's some personal wealth there if we're being more direct about it. And I think when you come from wealth, I had a very charmed childhood and upbringing and a lot of support from my family. And it does allow you to take certain risks that my friends can't take. And he always could take those risks, partly because he had the stability of the finances and the help and so many people willing to help him, but he turned it into his great talent of recruiting, marketing, fundraising, media manipulation, social media manipulation. And you'll see he's always got these ride or die, like technical founders who are doing the actual invention piece, who also serve that. And they let him take the credit. They let him be the face of the brand. It's repeated in his playbook from SpaceX to Tesla, although with Tesla it was more contentious. He was coming in, taking over as an investor and chairman and wresting the company from the founders. With SpaceX, he was really building it. I always say like SpaceX is kind of his favorite child. And just today, Forbes is reporting through their billionaires index, which evaluates executives' holdings and billionaires' holdings based on their most recent valuation of SpaceX. His holdings in SpaceX now are more valuable than the shares he owns of Tesla, partly because Tesla shares have been declining. Also, he lost a chunk of shares, or at least they're in limbo over the Delaware lawsuit in 2024 that found his CEO pay package at Tesla had been worth like $56 billion by the time he earned it out. And it was illegally granted, they said. You misled the shareholders into voting for this on the proxy, and this has to be rescinded. All these dynamics, I don't think any of us could have exactly predicted that Elon would have ended up leading this Doge initiative in the White House to like eliminate US capacity and personnel and spending and advising the president. But you could kind of see the ambitions along the way and how they grew pretty clearly because he usually just says it in a tweet.
I want to pick up on what you were saying there about like his actual understanding of this, right? Because one of the things that feels really apparent to me is that like back in those earlier days before he was like the ultra mega rich and powerful guy that he is today, or has even been for like the better part of the past decade, like he actually spent more time to understand what was actually going on with these businesses and like the engineering pieces behind him. Like you see in the earlier SpaceX days where he's reading like all of these engineering documents and these books about it and like really trying to understand what is going on here. And it feels like as we go on and as he gets more involved with so many other things and as his power continues to grow and people continue to praise him, that, or at least this is my kind of reading on it, that he seems to feel that this need to actually understand the foundationals, the fundamentals of what is going on in these various businesses that he's starting slowly erodes to the point where he's just assuming his understanding is correct rather than really going out to learn about these things. And that does feel like a fundamental difference that changes over time. I wonder what your read on that is.
It's really hard to estimate how much time he's spending investigating particular product engineering and other developments, but it is simply plain fact that no one can multitask that much without like some of their understanding eroding, right? I mean, you just don't have as much time across SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink, the Boring Company, X Corp, formerly Twitter, XAI, Doge, politics, his foundation, the PACs he's involved in, and anything else. Also, the expansion of the aims within those companies. SpaceX was first all about reusable rockets. Then it has become more so focused on the potential to make money through Starlink, through this constellation of lower Earth orbit satellites that they've put up for themselves and others. There's so much focused on Starlink that I have seen multiple news outlets refer to Starlink as a separate company, which it's not. There's a misunderstanding. And I always do the professional courtesy thing of like, hey guys, saw you said this. Like, are you aware it's owned and operated by SpaceX, right? SpaceX executives, including Gwen Shotwell, have talked at these investment conferences about, hey, we might keep SpaceX private and spin out Starlink and make it a public company at some point. So I think there are a lot of reasons leading to that misunderstanding, but it's like crazy how much Starlink feels like a standalone brand. Its life is completely tied to everything inside of SpaceX. And we've recently reported at CNBC and NBC about how Starlink's expanding its footprint within the federal government as well, like trying to convince the federal government to rely on SpaceX for even more than the launch services provided to the Department of Defense or these independent agencies like NASA, but also, hey, you can rely on SpaceX for Starlink. You know, maybe it's we want block grants to bring Starlink to areas where FEMA is dealing with emergency recovery efforts, or maybe it's this time putting the actual White House, or for our purposes in that story we did about a week back, General Services Administration, getting them their own Starlink network where like DOJ employees, special government employees can like log in and use one network, whatever building they're in, whatever agency they're working with that day. They're using Starlink for that.
Something that also we should note has profound security implications, right? Or issues potentially.
Yeah, like the Starlink story is so fascinating, and I want to come back to it a little bit more so we can dig into the current implications of this network and power that Elon Musk holds through controlling all these satellites in orbit and whatnot. But I wanted to go back to SpaceX's history as well, right? Because, you know, we were talking about its founding, how it's getting going, how it starts to get legitimized. But there's this step that it takes as well where it goes from this startup that is trying to create these rockets to something that is becoming increasingly integral to the US space program, to the US's ability to get things into space. And I wonder how it starts to make that transition and how it becomes this startup that's trying to make it to something that is increasingly getting government contracts, that the government is increasingly becoming reliant on. There's even legislation kind of being framed around the fact that there is this private company that can start to pick things up. So what do we see there in that shift that happens in the company, and how is that undertaken?
This is an interesting business question. Sorry if you thought this was going to be a tech chat.
Business pieces of this are also very important. So,
quite seriously, the US federal government, whether wittingly or unwittingly, created a near monopsony relationship with SpaceX. Part of that was due to NASA and Congress authorizing private sector companies to do business with the federal government and to conduct launches in the Commercial Space Act. Part of it also had to do with the way that these defense innovation grants and other grants get given without a mind towards, you know, whether there are like 1,000 flowers blooming. If one company is pulling ahead and the others aren't, you don't pull support for the one that's succeeding. And then all of a sudden, right, SpaceX is out there and we don't have a Blue Origin that can compete exactly yet. They're trying. Part of it's private market capital. You know, Musk supplemented everything he was doing at SpaceX with his wealth and shares from Tesla. He was able to also enthrall and keep investors confident in his abilities at SpaceX as Tesla hit its milestones and moved ahead and also kept its share price aloft in public markets. Looking back, it's really seems like remiss of the federal government to heavily index on one player. That said, if SpaceX was the only one who could do it, what is the federal government supposed to do if they also want those services and would rather not pay for them from a partner like Soyuz in Russia, right?
Did SpaceX kind of credibly corner that market, so to speak? Were they really the only one that could do it? Or why was Musk and SpaceX just so good at winning those contracts? Why did they emerge as sort of like the lone, for all intents and purposes, player there?
It's a really good question, when I'm not sure I'm totally equipped to answer, but part of it is the technology and the support for this from private sector backers and also the state of California. Don't forget, SpaceX was a Hawthorne, Southern California company. In this state, Musk has had a huge amount of support for creating jobs in manufacturing, and it wasn't just for Tesla. The federal government, again, as well, was giving a lot of grants and support. And then if you would win like an RFP for Department of Defense or NASA contract, you could also raise some more venture capital, private equity, right? And Musk had friends he had made rich and who would help make him rich again. It was like over and over. You'll see a lot of his backers in all of his companies, Solar City, Tesla, and SpaceX. Antonio Gracias is still on the board of SpaceX. Now he's in DOJ, apparently, reportedly, and also had gotten very, very wealthy off Tesla and had been a board member of Tesla and is one of Musk's close contacts in business and life. I feel that we have witnessed as startup and tech reporters, startups were often treated with kid gloves that maybe a larger company like in autos, it would be GM versus Tesla. Like GM had already had the ignition switch issues and had already spent sort of their good faith with regulators. And now they weren't going to get a lot of leeway. If they're going to make mistakes, they'll be perhaps more careful oversight, one would think, maybe. With a new player like a SpaceX at that time, as they're rising up from 2002 on, they're getting kind of kid gloves in this startup treatment, including in states with states regulators and including with federal regulators. Now, whether that's proper or official, I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think it's official. I don't think it's proper. Like, you would like to see rules applied evenly, but I'm also not a regulator or a lawyer or an entrepreneur. But you remember things like there was this Crew Dragon spacecraft that literally blew up on the test stand after it had already flown to the space station. You know, it's from a cause that could have potentially caused it to like blow up at the space station at ISS if it made it there. And SpaceX, they were cagey about it until footage leaked out to the public. And NASA at that time didn't force them to refly that test flight. And they were able to proceed. And we've seen things like this over and over again. I more recently had reported on environmental violations, even under the Biden administration, to which Musk had so many protests, right? The EPA said, hey, you're in violation of the Clean Water Act with these things here. The state of Texas tried to make room for them to go ahead and use this thing called a deluge system at their launch pad, you know, without all the usual permits in place. The EPA fines were like kind of negligible to a giant company. And the FAA seemed surprised when I asked them, hey, are you going to allow SpaceX to launch again? Like, considering these EPA notices of violation. Literally a few days later, they're like, the launch is delayed. And then SpaceX went crazy and they were like, starships are meant to fly, let us launch. And they acted like it was this egregious thing. And it's like the barest minimum of oversight. Like, hi, can you get this in line? We want to make sure you're compliant with the Clean Water Act before you launch again. You're in this community. You know, there's some wild federal land here, and it's also the Gulf, and maybe ixnay on the hot water, dumping all those gallons of like steaming hot water off the launch pad into the endangered species habitat there. So anyway, you see a lot of these like kid gloves applied to startups, and it's not just SpaceX. I mean, but I'm saying that is one factor. And then I think there was just so much hope that, you know, we would have exciting space missions, and there's so much like public support. And things can get overlooked when you are like hearing cheers of the audience online, right? And Musk is just masterful. You look at a NASA broadcast about some other launch and it's just like really straightforward or something. And what SpaceX did is to live stream like it's, you know, like the World Cup or something. It's not an explosion of a rocket. It's a rapid unscheduled disassembly or something else. The way they've done it is very smart, like pro space exploration propaganda.
I know you want to jump in, Brian, but there's two quick things I wanted to pick up on there, Laura, which is on the one hand, the role of government there, right? You talked about, I think it's the Commercial Space Act of 2004, or, you know, maybe I have the name slightly wrong. But then, of course, you know, we see with Barack Obama a further kind of deepening of that dependence on the private sector to deliver space services, and this like expectation that the next rocket that is going to bring astronauts from the United States to space is going to be from a private sector player. They're going to have much more involvement in like the design of those things rather than that being a NASA sort of thing and then it just contracts for it from Boeing or whoever else. And of course, you know, the lawsuit that Musk eventually brings, I think it's against the Defense Department for, you know, not kind of allowing SpaceX to get these sort of contracts. So it kind of forces its way through the door to start getting more of this public money. And then the other piece of it is not just on the government side, but, you know, you mentioned earlier how there was this connection to the Mars Society. There were a lot of really wealthy people who wanted to see a lot more stuff being done in space, and they wanted to see more innovation in space and for things to move forward there. And they were willing not just to put up with like an Elon Musk and a SpaceX and what is going on there, but I'm sure that they were helping to fund some of these things, especially early on, to help try to get this off the ground. So I just wonder if you have any other comments on those two pieces of what really helped SpaceX kind of get going and get solidified.
I mean, certainly the capital, these ride or die firms like Sequoia, Valor, who I mentioned before, and then later, you know, larger deals with like your Fidelities. Again, it's often funds that got very wealthy with Elon and other deals. It's a sort of Silicon Valley society. It's not just the space interest, but also like people that know how deals get done and know how to be patient, because venture capital, you're waiting for 10 years to see if your deal comes to fruition. And it's the Peter Thiel camp and the Sequoia camp. And they had other huge hits, like their investors in Meta, formerly Facebook, and they could afford to wait. Additionally, like SpaceX, it was an exciting recruiter. I think there was just buzz among engineers, developers, materials engineers. In some cases, also, Musk used Tesla assets to help SpaceX and vice versa. So you'll notice that there's a vice president of materials engineering who has worked for both companies concurrently pretty much the whole time that Musk was involved with both. I mean, close to the whole time. Charles Kuhlman. And you'll see that sometimes SpaceX is producing alloys for Tesla. And hey, Tesla, Solar City sold some, solar equipment to SpaceX. They kind of help each other out. And it's really hard to measure where all that help comes from and goes to and what it's worth in dollar amounts. I also think the market for data from satellites was growing so much at this time. And that was opportunistic. And SpaceX saw many more companies want to put satellites up, and they don't have to be GPS. It's not all GPS for the Department of Defense. Some of it is lower Earth orbit. And there's a huge market for everything from weather to, look at all the systems that sort of ride hail with SpaceX launches, right? They'll be bringing something up and they're releasing some of their own satellites on some flights, and on other flights, they're releasing satellites for paying customers. They can monetize differently than just a pure government contract, right? All of these things came together. It's really hard to be reductive about a complex company.
I also think that one of the key insights that we've kind of touched on, a little bit here and there is that, and maybe this didn't even occur to Musk initially, but became apparent after there was reaction from his peers, from the growing fan base, from people who like the Mars Society, was that I think no discussion would be complete of SpaceX without mentioning sort of the somewhat hollowed out state capacity to do these launches. This relative void left, at least compared to, say, the time when someone like Musk would have been growing up as a boy and seeing more media and hearing more about this rocket launches, and it was more of an active concern. And by the late 90s, early aughts, it did seem like that had been less a part of the public conversation, less a part of the sort of the sensory apparatus, there's no exciting major launches. And, like you mentioned, I think very astutely, how he presents them and puts them online, and there's live feeds, and they were always on Twitter, and it was always, but also just doing this in the first place and kind of like announcing it with this sort of masculine drive. We're going to do rockets and we're going to be big again. I think that really did appeal to a lot of people.
From startup and pitch competitions right to, the DoD. Silicon Valley really exported that kind of energy. And it's so funny because there were all of these business plan competitions at B schools and, engineering programs. And then there were hackathons, and it all sort of came together in these pitches. I really feel like that's just a whole energy that he capitalized upon because it was popular among all the venture capitalists and the startup founders he socialized with. But it also felt translatable to Hollywood, where he was in SoCal. So it felt like a TV ready, way of talking about tech. Not to say it's all just propaganda, because there's certainly a lot of achievement there. He also, again, used that for recruiting power and smartly hired someone like Gwen Shotwell to be his second in command or right-hand person as a chief of operations. And she brought all this credibility from industry. And then there's also just the appeal of living in California instead of certain other states where space centers are the big employers. Not everyone wants to live in Houston or like Huntsville or other places. So they had their pick of a different kind of engineer. They wanted to live near LA.
Speaking of that, like having the pick of the type of people who can come, and also like having the profile of Musk, the myth of Elon Musk to also take advantage of to get these people to come work at SpaceX, but also at Tesla. What kind of work culture does that then create? And what kind of pressures are put on the people who then work at SpaceX? And to what degree is that something that like they're okay with putting up with because they feel like they're contributing to this mission? And to what degree does the workplace just become really harsh because of the type of management that is in charge of it?
Musk companies are typically going to give very young people, and I mean young in their careers, regardless of their age, a lot of responsibility very early. They tend to want to do things differently. And partly it's like a high risk and can backfire and can be awful, especially for workplace safety and product quality, because if you're eschewing all of the old wisdom, you might miss some stuff. So there have been issues inside of SpaceX and Tesla where someone with a more traditional approach might not have missed this. And it led to, for example, an explosion or vehicles software needing to be patched or a rocket software needing to be patched long past the time you wish it would have needed a bug fix, right? So young people being able to get that responsibility early in their careers is a huge draw if you want a lot of responsibility and you want to make a mark. At the same time, again, like we have seen, Reuters did Pulitzer winning coverage of some of the workplace safety problems that led to worker deaths at SpaceX.
Could you talk about those for a second? Because I think a lot of people don't remember those tragic accidents in that period.
SpaceX worker deaths occurred with there were workplace injuries and crushed limbs. There were amputations, electrocutions. There was a death. And it's because workers were effectively like rushing to hit these goals, deadlines usually self-imposed by Elon. When you look at companies like Boeing and how long their deadlines slide, it's apparent like the industry's maybe disappointed, but pretty understanding and not very punishing when deadlines slide on these massive projects, right? But the company feels so dedicated to getting these aggressive deadlines done. For SpaceX, that it will often just push ahead. In one of the worker deaths that was reported in Reuters, it was workers were doing things like they wanted to move the materials, these huge components of rocket ships or the manufacturer of rocket ships around the lot, and they didn't have things battened down quite properly, and they weren't wearing protective gear that would help them if something went wrong and you had, a really tragic death in one of those instances because of the rushing and the
startup mindset. It was a startup mindset, right?
Exactly that. And I'm not trying to over-index. People have a tendency because of Musk's politics, his ideologies, his very far-right ideologies and who he's aligned himself with, to assume this is maybe just an Elon problem. It is an Elon problem, and it is a problem in heavy industry. All companies deserve this kind of like oversight and scrutiny. We should be holding all of their feet to the fire. But it has been pretty remarkable that SpaceX, for example, recently just went ahead with a second launch of Starship without completing the mishap investigation that usually they would need to complete to discover the root causes of all the problems and figure out how to mitigate those. And we saw 2 explosions in a row. And it looked very similar. And we're still awaiting more information from NASA, from FAA, from SpaceX, but you can see they continue to rush. They're rushing to, as they say, like get the data from each experimental flight or whatever. But if you think about it, if payload or God forbid, like people had been on board, that's no kind of way to run it. You would hope that when they are carrying payload or astronauts, cosmonauts, they will not be in this kind of experimental mindset or startup mindset. But it's very striking to see their assets blow up like that.
So I guess on the one hand, you see like management style, right? Like what Elon Musk is doing. And what immediately comes to mind is Walter Isaacson's book where he's talking about demon mode. And, I don't necessarily love that framing, but like Elon Musk coming in and telling people to do something really quick, regardless of whether it even really needs to be done just because he wants to see it happen. But then on the other hand, having these regulators who are not doing what they should be doing when it comes to Elon Musk's companies, even as they start to become really influential, really powerful.
And they're doing it slowly. You wonder why there's not greater urgency about it. It's not like the FAA didn't do anything, but it's hard too when you have a company that you think is communicating with you about all the details and they're not telling you, we have a notice of violation with the EPA. I think agencies rely on these companies to be good faith players, and sometimes, whether by incompetence, error, or malice, they're not always. I want to be considerate of regulators that are trying to do the right thing and trying not to impede innovation while they do it. Not to be too forgiving, because I do feel like regulators have way too often, Boeing, SpaceX, you name it, been so slow to act that it didn't have a single ounce of prevention. And then you wonder if a pound of cure will ever be possible. But they do try. You'll see things like Congress is initiating probes and letters. These committees are trying to find out, why is Musk denying the use of Starlink to US troops in Taiwan? You do see Congress reacting and demanding information. Can they always get it from SpaceX and from the agencies? No. Can the agencies always get it from SpaceX? I doubt that. SpaceX threatened to sue the FAA for regulatory overreach. They're just trying to implement and enforce existing rules. And they were bending over backwards to help SpaceX comply and be able to launch, what it looked like from my vantage. I don't think it's for a lack of trying at all. I don't think it's a totally permissive environment. I don't think that what government does is zero. I think government acts very slowly. And sometimes that nature of trying to be methodical and respect the institutions and the bureaucracy backfires terribly on the American public.
They are kind of up against this whole culture that has been cultivated around Silicon Valley companies, around sort of technological innovation, where they're very sensitive to not wanting to impede progress, as you said. And I think that's something that Musk has quite consciously taken advantage of, especially more with Tesla, but also, with SpaceX, sometimes going on the offensive.
I was just thinking, it was just this week that a court threw out the SpaceX lawsuit against the California Coastal Commission, which said, hey, in these lands that are part of our domain, these sonic booms are a question, other environmental impacts are a question, and we also have questions about conflicts arising from Musk's role promoting Trump, working with his campaign, and likely headed for the White House where he is now. SpaceX had accused the California Coastal Commission of political bias. And the judge basically said SpaceX doesn't appear to have been harmed. So, I don't understand the basis for this case at all. They've been given authorization also in Texas to move ahead with all these launches, even while people were putting in tons of public comments about closures of the beach or environmental impacts, where they wanted a full review, not just a quick review, but a full environmental assessment. You see the state just allowing them all the beach closures they want, and pretty much most, if not all of the launches they want permissions to launch. When the Coastal Commission pushed back, they got sued. When FAA pushed back, they got threatened with a suit. And then Musk contributed nearly $300 million to Trump's campaign and now has all this involvement with his Doge staff around FAA, around NASA, and it's anybody's guess how well they'll even be able to maintain any oversight of a person who's, excuse the phrase, but up in their grill.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I think that that's a perfect segue to start talking about what we are seeing now, as Musk has now fully sort of integrated himself into the Trump White House, as he has been using Doge to sort of go through various government agencies, and not only regulatory agencies or agencies that he has a bone to pick with, but with many different ones. That said, he has set his sights on NASA. Doge has installed Starlink on the White House, as you reported, as CNBC broke the story of. So, what is this looking like to you with this Musk, who you've reported on for all of these years, now arriving in the White House with all of this power and almost carte blanche to sort of wield it how he sees fit?
Yeah, there's so much being worked out that's in court now. There are so many legal challenges around Musk's role and actions with Doge. There's confusion around who he really reports into, President Donald Trump's office or this administrator, Amy Gleason, or what. And you'll see changing messages around it as, the litigation is brought forward, and then Musk and Trump's teams sort of change how they're describing it. And there's a lot of building the plane while flying it. Sorry, no wordplay intended. But what is clear is Doge has unparalleled access to very sensitive data on all residents in the US, pretty much, who are known to the government. It's an incursion into just about every single agency. I want to clarify. So New York Times broke a story this week that Starlink has now been installed in the White House itself. CNBC and NBC previously reported that Starlink was expanding its footprint in the federal government, and there was a Starlink network installed at the GSA. It's kind of amazing how much data is flowing through a company that's owned by Musk, right? While he is supposed to be merely advising the president, right? Now, all this White House data is flowing through Starlink, and it could be, we don't know what level of encryption and security, and we don't know how carefully this was all done.
If I might speculate for a second, I might interject with most likely not very carefully, but I can, pure speculation.
The public deserves to know why things were rushed into, these installations, right, of Starlink. Why were they rushed to the point where sources had told me that they skipped the normal reviews processes that you would go through for business procurement considerations, data security, info security considerations, and the rest? Yeah, the public wants and needs answers about how secure these things are, hopefully very secure, and we don't know yet, and that's kind of terrible.
Sorry to interrupt again, but the guy from 18F, one of the digital services agencies that was unceremoniously laid off, was on Blue Sky saying, I just don't see why you would even need to do this at all. These agencies are completely well connected to the internet. There's no want of internet access for them. So for him, it was just an enormous red flag from a security standpoint, because why do you need an alternate comms network that's run by a Musk company beaming information, as you just said, in between the agencies?
Right? Why do they need to share information around, different agencies Doge is working with? Why do you need a whole separate redundant network when we already paid for really good connectivity? Now, the White House spokesperson had told NBC today that this was donated or something, like Starlink was donated in one of those cases. And there have been other insiders at the White House who said, the Wi-Fi was crap and everyone knew it. But there are still these important questions. And then it all leads to the FCC, right? FCC is considering whether a contract that had gone to Verizon for affordable broadband access in these rural communities across the United States, maybe instead of fiber from Verizon and others, should partly go to Starlink. And this has been a football, right? They're passing it back and forth for years now. And Brendan Carr and others strongly have come out in favor of SpaceX in all kinds of statements and letters. And now he's at the helm of the FCC. Formerly was involved as a commissioner, but now is at the head. And these are big SpaceX proponents. Brian, you mentioned Doge, is inside NASA and Musk is heading for NASA. The person we think will come in as the NASA administrator after acting administrator Janet Petro is a guy who has been a customer of SpaceX, Jared Isaacman, and he's very well liked in tech circles, and he's flown a mission with SpaceX. And his payment tech company, Shift4, has an investment in SpaceX, and it's in the tens of millions. And so it affects their quarterly reports. And there's a question of what would Isaacman want to do with NASA, and how much of NASA's programs would be redefined? Would they go to private sector? Would they go outside of the independent space agency over to Space Force and the Department of Defense? It's just crazy that Musk, to me and to so many, the questions around the conflicts of interest and the legality of all of this abound. And the cybersecurity questions are really chilling, especially considering how Musk has expressed very favorable sentiment about China, which is an aggressor against Taiwan, and about Russia and its conflict with Ukraine. He's said things that sound like Kremlin talking points. And so, you wonder how vulnerable would Starlink be.
And you report a lot on NASA and the space industry. And, have you talked to anybody in NASA? Like, what's the mood? What's the feeling as Doge and Musk's footprint only stands to further increase at this moment?
There are questions on questions. And when I connect with NASA employees, they are finding it hard to focus on the work, because they have so many unanswered questions about leadership and about Doge and why Doge people are operating around and within NASA. They have so many questions, it's like anxiety inducing, and they don't have answers on RIFs, reductions in force. I forget which administrator had said this, but someone had actually said they wanted to make federal employees feel like almost traumatized when they come to work. They want to reduce the federal workforce to just people who are so committed they can put up with all this. I think it was Russell Vogt. And that's the atmosphere they're working in. And, Musk, when he took over Twitter after that leveraged buyout, did something similar where it was like, if you're not just ride or die on board with myself and the people I'm bringing in, we don't want you anywhere near this. If you're not on board with our mission, our free speech mission, sort of free speech mission. And it's similar too. Some of the Doge employees are from Tesla and SpaceX and XAI. We've reported on this. Others have reported on this. Others come from a Silicon Valley funded tech background. One of the Doge people involved in HUD is an AI entrepreneur, with a good rep in that industry, but more Silicon Valley than not.
It's really shocking to see the movement here and what is ultimately going to happen to NASA. Obviously, Musk is talking about how the moon program should be ended because he wants to go straight to Mars. So we'll see what's going to happen there, and if his kind of favored person to take over it is going to act on those sorts of things.
And can you imagine what NASA and all the grant writers, all the grant givers would have said if they knew SpaceX would end up with that point of view? No more moon to Mars, but we just want to go straight to Mars. I mean, would they have gotten that support and funding from NASA if they weren't on board with that? But I mean, SpaceX hasn't developed a lunar lander of its own. So it kind of makes sense in a way, but it's also a little bit, it feels like taking the money and running a little bit.
I read some speculation that maybe this is just pure speculation and not accurate, but SpaceX is behind on the part of the moon project that it is supposed to deliver. And if the project gets canceled, it won't kind of be totally exposed for having to delay the project because it doesn't have its piece done. I don't know if you know if that's at all accurate, but
it's not an irrational thesis. I'll say
okay.
It's not an irrational thesis, but we need to hear more from SpaceX and NASA on all of that. I'll be very interested to see whether Isaacman makes it in. Again, I know he's very well liked in tech and aerospace circles, but with all of the tension around Doge and Musk and conflicts, it could be a tall order.
Now, how long have you been reporting on Musk and his companies and SpaceX and the space industry?
SpaceX and then Starlink have been more on my radar in recent years as SpaceX has become more and more valuable, including to Elon. It's always been part and parcel because the Musk story is one of his empire, the companies he's building concurrently and whether he could do this thing. We've seen Jack Dorsey with Square and Twitter. Now it's Block and X, right? Really, this is atypical of in all of business. You do not see founders dividing their time like this. There are a lot of legal reasons it's very risky and just taxing on you personally. I mean, I've been at CNBC almost 8 years, and it's been part of my coverage this whole time. I often would tackle like labor or climate impacts of SpaceX rather than covering each launch and so forth. And I covered new space long before that, like with the X Prize and Burt Rutan's first launch, the influx of venture capital to aerospace when I used to cover VC for Wall Street Journal. So it's been a long time of me asking Elon if he wants to comment and him completely ignoring me or maybe calling me a liar for accurate reporting.
And what's been the biggest thing that's sort of changed over that time? Like, what's the biggest sort of evolution that you've seen?
Musk's empire shifted from California, Hawthorne, Fremont, and Lathrop, and the batteries in Moss Landing and all this stuff. So they established for Tesla the battery factory up in Nevada, and that's a red state. And then you saw SpaceX expand to this incredible, massive, sprawling facility in Texas. And you could see that red states and favors they could afford him would be a bigger deal to what he was looking towards in the future. And especially when Tesla began to establish an Austin factory, you could see he had sort of squeezed all the support he could out of California, all the customers and recruits out of California. And now he was focusing on red states, Nevada, and more so Texas. I remember talking about that, about how a good lens for Elon's general outlook is opportunism. You could predict a hard right public swing, even though he's always sort of played both sides of the aisle for whatever he could get and palled around with lots of California Republicans in the past. You could very much predict this, even ahead of the Twitter deal, just by the investments in Texas.
One thing that I've been really interested in this sort of late era Elon, is if we call him, is the way that his interest in Twitter, now X, and becoming the main character there has been so important to him. The way that he sort of leverages his other companies and his exploits at the other companies and the achievements of everybody at those other companies that he largely takes credit for has shown up in that feed now, that is distilled now, that we're seeing it all. And to this day, I think maybe the most important thing to him is tweeting rockets. He's tweeting about immigrants, something about Doge, rocket. It's, the left was so mean to me, the far left must be canceled, rocket. So it's like this stew. The one constant is he's always tweeting out pictures of the achievements of SpaceX. Do you think it's fair to say that this is like a foundational to his myth that we see, like, the Superman making the rockets as he's sort of now wielding government power?
I do think that's been a facet of Elon's communication style all this time. He loves to point to the achievements of SpaceX while things are sort of rocky or falling apart with his other companies. That is because they're sort of like undeniably scientifically interesting.
Yeah, and the images and it looks really cool. Yeah.
They're very visual, but it's kind of funny. I have done analysis just backdating stock prices at Tesla to see if they fluctuated with missions that were successful or not with SpaceX. And it didn't bear out, at least not right around the dates of the missions. And so there were these assumptions that like he was using talk of SpaceX to boost Tesla's stock price. Or I don't think that's the case. But I do think that it's from a PR vantage, from his self-image building. He loves to talk about SpaceX because it seems to burnish this idea that he's an engineer rather than an entrepreneur and a financier. He doesn't like to be known as a business magnate. He even asked people to edit his Wikipedia some years ago, so it wouldn't say that, but he is a businessman. You might say it engineering the rockets, right? I mean, is he involved? Yeah, sure. Does he understand it? A lot, a good deal. Like he understands a lot, but he's not an engineer and he wants to be known as one. And that's important in his legacy. And so he does that all the time. That's not to detract from his other achievements or whatever. But I mean, he also does it when he's like, wants to say, hey, even if you hate my politics and my endorsing AfD, the extremist anti-immigrant party in Germany, and you really dislike my making this gesture that scholars of fascist history called a Nazi salute, I still run this team that made the cool rocket.
And that's so interesting because back to what you said, or like when he was really, he did learn the engineering and the science of the rocket. So I have become expert enough at this to sort of bring this industry sort of into the future and get the accolades and be successful here. And then, as Paris, you mentioned, now kind of is at least Neuralink, boring. Like he can do maybe the assumption is that he can just download the expertise or at least play act it and accept some of the accolades too, including going into the government, right? And understanding how governments, because that's been one of the small, minor silver lining pleasures, is watching him like discover how like government agencies work for the first time and then like tweet about his findings as though he's the first one to, know how the payroll works or social security or what have you. So I do think like that maybe this expertise is or his assumption that he can be expert.
It's like ode to expertise, right?
Right.
His expertise is being an entrepreneur.
Yes.
And a fundraiser and a marketer and a recruiter. And he knows about engineering, but he doesn't know as much as some of the people that are actually building the rockets and things like that. He takes advantage of his involvement to try to present himself like an engineer and like an expert in all these things. I mean, whomst among us, right? Dunning-Kruger says that we all think we're better than average at things. And he has the risk appetite and is bringing this money, but also he breaks things very profoundly. And he will lean on, hey, but I put together a cool company in SpaceX and they did amazing things with rockets. He's trying to draw your attention to that. Now, you talk to people inside of aerospace and they're like, yeah, like SpaceX isn't the only one. They do it differently. It's cool. Like it's interesting. But when you talk to people in tech generally that don't know aerospace as well and don't maybe know the finer points to criticize, they fall for it. I mean, why not? Like, I get it. I understand. People are very excited about what satellites and Earth observation can bring to us and the idea that launches could be affordable and reusable and rockets could be reusable. But I just think the bloom is off the rose. He's revealed so much about his ideology that it kind of almost doesn't matter anymore. So we can talk about the business achievement, but everyone knows who he is now.
Related to that, I had one final question for you, and that's really around power. You mentioned, early in the interview that, according to the rankings on Forbes now, that SpaceX and its valuation, of course, SpaceX is a private company, it's not a publicly traded company, that it contributes a lot to Elon Musk's actual wealth. And we've also talked about in this conversation how Starlink, is expanding through the US government, but we've also seen how other countries have been making deals for Starlink. There have been questions in some countries now as to whether those deals should continue because of Elon Musk's politics, because of the influence that he has, because of his threats to cut it off in Ukraine and Taiwan and wherever else. When we look at SpaceX and Starlink, how do we see that supporting the power that Musk has today? And do you think that there are vulnerabilities in those companies that people would be able to target in order to reduce that power?
This is interesting. So one clarification is that the Trump administration rather, threatened that the US government could force Starlink to cut off service to Ukraine. Musk and SpaceX have said that they would not do that as a company.
But they have shut off some Starlink service in places that Ukraine was previously depending on it in.
They did previously deny and cut off access to Ukraine troops in Crimea, and it significantly impacted their battlefield strategy and benefited Russia. Poland, one of their NGOs, funded Starlink in Ukraine, and Poland's leadership has said they're going to look into alternatives for Ukraine. SpaceX has never turned on Starlink over Taiwan, and the Wall Street Journal reported that that was at the request of Xi through conversations with Putin. That's pretty chilling. Musk has downplayed the report that he was having conversation with Putin that were not authorized or known to the US government. He said all the conversations he had were authorized or known or what have you. There's a lot of mystery around that. Sorry for the background. You asked if people should be concerned in other countries about using Starlink, or if maybe people in the US should be concerned that foreign countries are enabling Starlink. The more Starlink is at play, the more power SpaceX has and Musk has as the owner of SpaceX. With foreign Starlink, it's just stunning how much power he could amass. And any SatComs company could, but when you look at the countries that it would be expanding to, that matters. So you want to evaluate which countries it would be crucial to, right? A big commercial force in India based in the US, would that make us closer globally or would it make us more tense? There's something I need to bring up about Starlink, which is SpaceX needs to replenish its supply of lower Earth orbit satellites every 5 years. For now, the satellites it's launching up there are only meant to operate effectively for 5 years, and sometimes they may not last that long. So the company needs to keep up with the launches, needs to keep permission to launch and permission to deploy those satellites to keep that constellation going and deliver the same or better level of service. In Brazil, we saw Brazil's government and their equivalent of a Supreme Court ruled that X was not compliant with their national laws about social media and safety. While Musk was resisting X Corp coming into compliance with British laws, X Twitter was banned in Brazil for like a couple of weeks. Brazil has done this with WhatsApp, other apps. It's not like only targeting Musk, but Musk acted like he was this big murderer and these laws had never applied to any other social company. And Starlink got caught up in it because he had financial holdings in both in the country. And Starlink was not taken offline. And Starlink had to comply with the rule that it would cut off use of X by its users. But there was a standoff there. And that's illustrative of how his one company can give him power in another company or not. Ultimately, he backed down there because he didn't want to lose the market for either or both. It's interesting to contemplate, but as you think about Musk's ability to influence policy or battlefield strategy or battlefield outcomes, it's really important that we have regulators and a Congress that evaluates this in a clear-eyed manner and takes action in an appropriately urgent manner if something should come up that is actually dangerous to us here on the ground in the States or to any ally. It's a discomforting question.
It absolutely is. And on the wider SpaceX point beyond Starlink, do you see vulnerabilities in that business, how it's currently operating? Like for a long time, the narrative was, SpaceX is doing so great. It's going from like strength to strength. It feels like there are growing questions, though, about how that business is actually working, what its financials actually are. Even as you say, there is still a lot of excitement from certain investors around what it could mean into the future.
Yeah, I mean, Starlink is theoretically in demand. The more people that join the network, when you have satcoms, like the slower it can go in a particular region due to bandwidth issues, which is different with fiber. It's not an issue with fiber, which is part of the reason the FCC wanted to give rural communities fiber broadband instead of Starlink. There are questions about the launches, how much they cost when you look at it's like basically it's a very expensive way to deliver these megabits per second, considering they have to replace those satellites. So there's that. There's also the cost of making the Starlink terminals. They had moved some production to like Vietnam, but with the tariff and trade wars that are affecting all these hardware companies, I actually wrote about this the other day. I found a letter that SpaceX sent to the trade representative saying, hey, we want reciprocal tariffs, or we want our tariffs to look exactly like other countries to protect us here because we're paying a lot of fees over there. And part of it's on the equipment. And like they're very subject to trade wars and tariffs that Musk has seemed to endorse in his allegiance with Trump. Those are really important business questions. What happens to them with the tariffs and the hardware production and the export and import and the rest. But additionally, it is just big picture. Launches every 5 years to support and replenish this constellation are very expensive. And so we might see, alternative methods of delivering internet that are not as expensive. And the tech's always evolving. I'm very interested in alternative solutions, whether they're satellite-based or other, but to comms. And that's a real concern. But I think SpaceX investors have been and will be very patient. So far, they have been like hanging on since 2002, and they can sell on these private markets. That liquidity is there. And effectively, SpaceX does the counterpart to like a buyback sometimes, buying back shares on private equity type marketplaces. So TLDR, it's a very expensive way to deliver that much data per second in internet service, but it's great because there's no equipment like required to plug in. You can get it up and running on your like RV or your boat. And so it has a lot of appeal at the same time. I don't want to discount that. It's just the expense question is real. Also not clear how much money SpaceX just blew on those Starship explosions. It's a very capital intensive business.
Yeah, I've heard some certain questions around viability of Starship. Let's put it that way. Lora, this has been absolutely fascinating to learn about the history of SpaceX, how it contributes to everything around Musk. I wonder, Brian, any final thoughts before we close off the episode?
The one thing that's happening right now that's very SpaceX centric is that there is a capsule, I think, attaching to the International Space Station right now as we speak. Obviously, this will hopefully have been resolved for the better. And the 2 astronauts who have been on the ISS for 9 months now, I believe, are coming down. And I think this just crystallizes a lot that we've talked about, because NASA has been saying like there's a Boeing equipment failure that left them there. The right and Trump and Musk have framed this as a failure of the Biden administration, and they've been stranded. And NASA has been saying, no, that's not really the case. They're okay. And the astronauts have been saying, well, we've been at work up here. But we see this collision of narrative and politics, and Musk using SpaceX as something that can generate some positive political capital for him. What do you make of this sort of episode that's unfolding as we speak?
My colleagues and I have reported around all of this. And
a good deal, I should add. A lot of good reporting. You should go read it.
Thanks. The agency basically adjusted its, rotation of astronauts. Musk and President Trump have presented this like it was some failure of the Biden administration, but this was a NASA Boeing discussion around safety and also needs. Like there wasn't a need for an emergency ship to go up and fetch these 2 astronauts. So were they stranded? In a manner of speaking, yes, but more so, it's more like they were waiting for the next bus. And SpaceX is bringing that bus, and very valuable, and that's great. But it wasn't worth sending like a whole extra mission to fetch them, because they were safe on board and had actually prepared to spend 9 months and just do the research as long as they were up there. That was a better use of resources. It's been presented as like a political thing, but it turns out it's not exactly that, unless you felt it was an emergency and they needed to get back for safety, which NASA did not. And that was a NASA full of career employees who work for the Independent Space Agency. It was represented a certain way, and I'm really rooting for a safe return of the SpaceX with these astronauts and everything. And congratulations to everybody who's endured all this and managed it so professionally. But like at the same time, this has just been practically smeared in the public view, the whole mission being turned into this political thing. I mean, that's not what you'll hear from NASA and SpaceX insiders, I don't think, even though Musk is so tightly aligned with Trump now. I think from the vantage of Musk, he was like, we can do it. Why shouldn't we? And NASA's like, well,
it's a good illustration of all of the forces we've been talking about, right? Like the recklessness or the moving fast, the drive to move fast versus the agency's sort of more instinct to look at safety protocols and to do things and to have contingency plans, right? Like there was a contingency plan, like you mentioned. If this didn't work out safely, then we'll take the safest and most rational course of action, which is to have you do research on the space station while we prepare for the next mission that you can come home on. The next bus, as you put it. I really like that.
If it's not move fast and break things, it's move fast, get paid more money, and rack up all the positive PR while also painting myself as a martyr.
Unless, God forbid, there's a real risk, as there always has been, that if things don't work out and if there's another accident or this breaks and they can't board that, then as there has been from the beginning, Musk and SpaceX risk taking the fall for that too.
They'll never take the fall. There's always some rapid unscheduled disassembly sort of thing.
Right.
No, I'm just teasing. But they got PR game, but it's like, when you're a reporter, you're just interested in the facts and not necessarily the narrative. So,
well, listen, thank you so much for all of that. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I've really appreciated all of your insights and your time here and your reporting over the years. Again, seriously, go check out Lora's work at CNBC and her team. It is consistently the most reliable and stimulating reporting done on SpaceX and Musk and NASA and all of this.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your interest and in the long story and the big picture and my work. And I look forward to your ongoing coverage. This is a great idea for a series.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Laura. System Crash is hosted by Paris Marks and Brian Merchant. Production is by Eric Wickham. Our theme music is Dystopia by our good friends in Yacht. Support the show on patreon.com/systemcrashpod to get a monthly bonus episode.
Bye.